Greetings and welcome. Today we're going to be painting a very misty waterfall, a subject I actually love painting, and all of the tools and materials will be listed in the video description. If you'd like help with the drawing process, I will have the traceable up over on Patreon, along with fun things like that of the reference photo, all of my ebooks. You can get access to our exclusive Facebook group. There's a bunch of bonus lessons, so if you're interested in any of that, go check it out, link in the description. But I'll also be painting the entire thing with the brand new brush set, which just launched earlier this month. So if you want to work with exactly the same tools that I am, that is now an option, and again, that will be linked in the video description. With that, let's have some fun and jump right in. We're going to begin here today with a 1-inch flat-headed brush, and we will proceed to dip the bottom third of it into a little bit of water, then wipe off the excess. This will just help keep our paint wet for a longer period of time, and it'll be great for blending larger areas like that of the sky. With that, we're going to head to our palette, grab an abundance of titanium white, about maybe 1/8 that of our cerulean blue, and another maybe 1/10 that in Mars Black. It's just a very strong pigment, and we're essentially rendering a somewhat desaturated but bright blue for the bottom of our sky, which we will start working in around the waterfall. And we're using the 1-inch flat-headed brush like this because it does have those nice sharp edges, which allows us to cut around the line work of our subject. But then we can also flip it on its side and get these much larger applications. That said, as we move up, we're going to progressively make this slightly more blue and darker. So we're going to double the amount of cerulean blue, we'll double the amount of Mars Black, get a good mix so that there aren't areas that are somewhat black, somewhat blue, somewhat white. We want it to all fit together. Then we'll work right on top. Spread it all the way across first, and then we'll go in for the blend. And when we blend, to avoid a streaky aesthetic, we work very softly back and forth. Now we'll continue to yet again add more of our cerulean blue, more of our Mars Black, and we can get a little bit more aggressive with the inclusion of these two as we start to work towards the corners of the painting, as we want to create a slight vignette to draw the eye in towards the center of the piece, as the eye will innately go to the brightest point. And if we can make that the center, closer to our primary subject, then we can subconsciously move that eye of the viewer where we want to. Also, you notice as I do the corners, I am not trying to drag that paint from one side to the other. I'm taking a little break, I'm grabbing extra paint, I'm going back in. That way we don't thin it too much. Because our brush is somewhat damp and we're using an abundance of paint, we don't really have to worry about dry time all that much, so we don't have to stretch it from one side to the other. Now here I'm very purposefully trying to create a bit more of a loose stroke. So, using Conte, I've gone in and resketched the top of our cliff here. Now we're sticking with the 1-inch flat, but we're incorporating a new color. That is our sap green. And I'm actually going to grab a good amount of that, start a new mix over here to the left. We're going to grab about 1/4 of that in our Mars Black, and then we'll grab about half of it in titanium white. So more titanium white than Mars Black, but more sap green than anything else. And we're going to start by mixing what will eventually be our brightest sap green. So this is something that I want, and I want to save for later. And I'm going to place a little bit over here on my palette. Now we're going to darken this and create a mid value. So I'm doubling up the amount of Mars Black, just like so. We'll add a little bit more. And you can see I'm making a real abundance of this pigment because we have a lot of surface area to cover. I also want this green to be a bit cooler because we want it to have a very unified atmosphere. So we'll grab, at this point, about 1/5 of our cerulean blue. And I think this will be a really beautiful green to work as our base layer. So yet again, much like how we began with the sky, I'm working on the edges of the waterfall, because when we have fresh paint, our brush is damp, we have the greatest ability to render very sharp, intentional line work. And as we start to run out of paint, that becomes more and more difficult. So when we have an abundance, we do this. You can see that I'm rotating the brush so that I continuously get those strokes. I'm not trying to make one continuous line, I'm breaking it up into a large collection of them. And then once I have that, I can press harder with my brush and start to fill in all of this negative space. But we start with a very subtle application. And here, I'm going to change my brush stroke a little bit. This is all going to be the waterfall. And I want a little reminder of where that's going to be. So I'm just going to leave a couple vertical brush strokes in here. Just like this. And you can even leave a tiny bit of texture. It's fine, we're going to cover it up with water for the most part anyway, as well as a darker layer. But then as we get towards the sides, I'm moving the brush in the direction in which a lot of the moss-covered rocks are going to be going, which is in the same axis and line as the top. We'll grab more. I'll also attempt to not put my hand in front of the painting process to too great of a degree. There we go. I'm going to grab a little bit of water. Help me get a little bit more out of my pigment. We're going to dodge this rock structure here in the foreground because we want to do that with a bit of a darker base. And much like this side, my brush strokes are going to go predominantly in the direction of the top of the rock. And of course, here we get an amalgamation of the two. Sometimes these diagonal lines work into the center, sometimes these center lines work into the diagonal. But you can tell that there's a difference in application, and that's just what we want. There we go. Make sure that this layer is nice and thick. You might want to do 2 of it. But again, thick applications and multiple applications will make it look a lot more professional. Now that our canvas is fully dry to the touch, we're going to continue with the flat-headed, and we're going to render a darker mixture of what we have here. This is going to be for all of the shadows and crevices that we have within this moss-covered rock. So, you can see that my palette also dried, but I'm going to remix on top of my previous color. That way I can see the contrast between the two and ensure that I am moving in the right direction. Now, this is something that I do want to still have both green and blue in it. It should be green dominant, but it should also, as you can see, be quite a bit darker than what we were previously working with. And I am still incorporating titanium white, not to brighten the pigment, but to desaturate it a little bit, because we're still working with a lot of blue and green. And I think this right here will be a great first pigment for the darker application. Now, for the actual application process, we are switching to a fan brush. This one is a stiff bristled fan brush, and we can actually make it a soft bristled fan brush by making it wet, really unique that way. But we're going to start with a stiff bristled approach. So, we're going to grab our paint by very lightly dragging our fan brush onto our newly mixed pigment. We don't want to mix with this brush because we don't want to condense the bristles. And by just grabbing paint like this, we don't do that. And then I'm going to, through a series of taps, create the crevices that are going to in large part determine the shapes and movements within the rock. And it's going to look a little awkward initially. It's going to make this area look almost fuzzy to a point. And that's intentional. That is a-okay. It is nothing to worry or concern yourself about. It is just part of the process. You can see that we're leaving openings in between. I am never dragging the brush either. It's always a tap, and then I rotate the brush not on the canvas, but in the air. And we are going to do more subtle applications of this kind once the pigment on our brush starts to run out. So now that it has, I can just add a little bit of loose texture in between those openings, but it's not so much to the point where it detracts from the general movements that are occurring, right? So I'm just looking at my reference photo to see how these progress. You can also draw them back on with Conte should you want to, but I want these to be fairly organic and loose. We're also going to have a lot of them coming out from the waterfall. There's going to be a lot of shadow behind the waterfall because, of course, it just can't adopt the same amount of light. The top of it can be a bit brighter, so I like to start in the middle or towards the bottom and then work my way up. And for the most part, I'm working with horizontal taps in here. But I'm also jumping around pretty frequently. And I'm doing that so that I don't become too repetitive with my stroke. And again, just going into those openings when I have almost no paint left on my brush and delivering the slightest amount of texture. Again, looks awkward right now, that's okay. Let's remix more of this. So my brush is damp. We are remixing on top of the previous pigment, which is still wet. We just want more of it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to try to take from what we already have on the palette, build on it, but I am going to leave a little bit around the edge just in case I mess up this new pigment. I can still have the previous rendition as a reference point. There we go. Looking quite nice, fairly close. I think we just add a hint more titanium white. And we're there. Now I'm going to try to flatten it out. That way the fan brush can pick it up easily. Put that down. Grab the fan brush. Grab the pigment. Now we can do significantly more of these applications towards the bottom here, because the closer we get to the bottom, the farther away we get from the light, right? We can also add just a little bit more of this towards the edges. And we're doing that to do what we did in the sky. Create a slight vignette, draw that eye inwards. I am essentially having it act as a progressive gradient, but not one that's done through soft markings, one that's done through a series of textural taps. And you can see that it's slowly starting to come together. We have these different motions for the insets. As we get towards the bottom, we go with something nice and definitive, a bit darker. There we are. And we can really see a lot of differentiation through the applications right now, very specifically in the period in which we apply the paint. Here we have very sharp markings from when we have new paint and paint in abundance. Here we have somewhat softer markings from when that paint is starting to wear off, and then here we have very soft markings. Also, I noted how our brush strokes, for the most part with the base layer here, we're going horizontally but also in the direction of this top. We're doing that over here with a lot of these incisions. So you can see that it gradually works its way inwards. There's a real progression. I'm trying to make sure that it doesn't look like stairs as well. So we're occasionally taking one cutting into the other as you move down and in. We can recreate that over here where we see fit. Big fan of not taking any area to full completion when we're initially doing it. I really like to take it about 80% there, purposefully leave it unfinished, and then go back to it once I see what more of the canvas looks like. And I do that for balancing purposes, because we don't want to overdo one area and have it force us to overdo other areas. It's a less is more until we see the larger picture, and then we can do more. Also, again, a lot of the top is going to be brighter, so I'm doing this now that I have almost no paint. Now I'm just going back in, adding a little bit of very soft texture. Creating more of that intentional line work on this side again. You can create larger, darker areas as well. And we don't want anything too bright. So I'm just going to do one final pass with very minimal amounts of paint over everything. And this is a lot like a glaze or a wash. I'm not trying to disrupt any of the line work. I'm very simply just trying to make that hue, or rather the value, slightly darker. The hues will be the same. There we go. Now, once everything is fully dry to the touch, we are going to head back to our larger flat. And I want to mix a green in between the brightest green, which we previously designated and are saving for more of the foreground, and the green that we used for our initial base layer. So, I'm going to grab sap green, titanium white, Mars black, and aim for something right in the middle of these two. And I'm also, as you can see, mixing it right in the middle of those two very intentionally, just to make it a little bit easier. I'm even overlapping to a point. I think it needs to be slightly darker. And this is really just going to be trial and error, back and forth. It can also be slightly more saturated than this pigment, but we don't want it more saturated than that one. I also want a hint of blue in it, so we'll work that in. And I think that's actually a really beautiful mix. So, we're not going to apply it with this brush. We want something much more detail-oriented, and we want a little bit more control than what the fan brush can offer. So we're going to be switching to our smaller liner, or rigger brush. We're going to start by making sure that it's nice and damp, dipping it in some water, taking off the excess water. That way all of our bristles are condensed and we can get a very sharp application. It'll also allow us to drag our paint out a little bit farther, which is nice. But we'll grab that pigment. And now we're going to essentially apply and allocate moss and texture, which is sitting on top of a lot of this. Now when we apply water, it's going to thin it, so we're going to see more of that base layer showing through. That's okay. It might mean that you want to make the color a little bit brighter to account for the fact that it is going to initially here not be as stand out. It might take a couple layers to build up. Again, easy to expedite that process. And a lot of these applications are done not just through line work, but they're through a series of taps which amalgamate into lines. And there's a big difference there, right? Because if we do a lot of line work, we're going to void opportunity for detail and texture. And this is moss, so we want it to have a good amount of texture. That said, it's also not incredibly close to us, and because of that, a balance of the two can be very beneficial. This will essentially be all taps. It's closer to us, we can see that detail. But when we're in the distance, we make that concession of detail to create depth. So we do the taps to honor the subject itself and the application pattern that will deliver the grand idea of what it is, but we play that balance as well. So it's a lot of taps, it's a couple drags. And you can see that we're slowly forming these larger movements for the rock. Now these are, right now, admittedly, quite distinct. We have a heavy contrast between a lot of the inset rock and the protruding moss, but it's going to be softened, and to a fairly great degree, when we add in the mist of the waterfall, which will bring a lot of the values in together. So we're purposefully working with something slightly higher contrast, recognizing that as we continue to progress in the painting, that is going to be mitigated to a point. I also recognize that I'm starting to speak a little bit more slowly. I'm just trying to decide how I want this to progress up into this area. I'm looking at the reference photo, but I'm also saying, you know what? Reference photos are fantastic in that they provide us with a look at a subject to a greater degree than that of what our imagination can typically handle, right? When we think about subjects, trees, clouds, rocks, etc., typically, a lot of us still go back to what we thought these things looked like when we were younger. So renditions done in cartoons, storybooks, things of that nature, right? And they're simplified. But when we really look at them in person, we find all of these additional intricacies we wouldn't naturally think to incorporate. And reference photos provide us with that information, right? All that information that we might just not have been open to in the past. However, we don't want our reference photos to handcuff us to certain ideas. We want to be able to take artistic liberties, build on these subjects in the way that makes them unique and to our liking, and it's about finding that balance. And when I get really quiet, or when my sentences become disjointed, it's often because I'm trying to find that balance. And I really want to stress the importance of that, because I think a lot of really great artwork comes together when you combine that which you see on the photo and that which you have in your head, that which makes a piece unique to you and your artistic stylings. Because there isn't a right or wrong way to make art, it's all just so subjective and personal. Even when you're working on these lessons, you are interjecting so much of yourself, so many of your own ideas, patterns, application styles, and that's not a bad thing at all. So much like the reference photo, I want you to think of me as someone who's here to help, guide you, give you ideas, allow your painting to become maybe a little bit more technically proficient and a little bit more complex, but you can still make it your own and find that really beautiful balance. Now we'll just get a little bit closer for this side over here. I'm a big fan of painting from a bit of a distance and filming from a bit of a distance typically as well, because it gives you a more holistic look at the painting and how everything fits together. It lets you build atmosphere more effectively. And it's one of those things where sometimes you sacrifice detail and technique because painting from farther away is a little bit more tricky, just technically. But I think atmosphere is often the most important part of a painting. So we make that sacrifice to a point. But once we know that atmosphere is there, once we know that everything is cohesive, then we can move in and refine to a greater degree. But when we do this, remember to take 5, 6, 7 steps back every couple of minutes. That way you can reassess the painting as a whole. And that way you don't hyper focus on it. Because it's really easy to kind of tune into the point where we make a portion look gorgeous. We love it and it's our favorite part of the painting, but then it doesn't match with anything else. And then we have to drastically simplify it or heavily increase the detail everywhere else. And often it doesn't make sense to increase the detail everywhere else, because while it looked great in that one area, it would be too much everywhere. And that one area is forcing us to do it everywhere. It goes back to that larger idea I was talking about earlier of when I paint, I like to recognize that there are some areas that just should have more detail and some that shouldn't. And we make those concessions throughout the painting process. There we go. You can see it's lots of little shelves that kind of connect into each other. They're all on this larger axis. I think that looks really good. Now, before we actually paint the water, one more quick step. I want to take some of the green that we've been using for the highlight, move that over into the darker area that we used for the shadows. Grab some Mars Black, remix that into that darker mixture, and we can use the liner brush for this. We don't need the flathead just because we don't need a massive amount of paint. We'll make it fairly damp. And then the area in here, the area in which we are going to have the actual waterfall, I'm going to go back in, make some of those darker insets, and as the paint runs out, I'll also just lightly glide the brush over these areas. And what we're trying to do is we're trying to make this area just a little bit darker than everything else while connecting it to the rest of the painting. This way, the highlight of the water, which will be a much brighter pigment, much more so a cerulean blue, titanium white, a little bit of Mars Black, but this will help that stand out. And again, this area where the waterfall is going to be a little bit darker, just because the water isn't going to, or rather the light isn't going to be able to penetrate the water and brighten it to the way it brightens all of the rock on the sides, which it simply has to just sit on, right? Has to work through the water. It can just lightly graze the top of these sides. And as previously noted, we're going to make the bottom area even darker. Just like this. So not a grand amount of work should be done here. And we don't want to kind of hinder the larger textures that we've built. But something like this can help. Now, for this next step, we are going to want to ensure that all of our brushes are perfectly clean, the water is clean, The canvas is fully dry, and here you can see I've gone on and did a slight light drawing of where the waterfall is going to be. You don't have to do that, and you can do it to a much greater degree than I did. Again, it's all personal preference. But we also want clean colors on our palette. You can see that the blue was diluted by a couple colors, the white by the green, the black also had some green in it, so I grabbed some fresh pigments, and we're going to start on the water. Now, we're not going to start with a pure white. In fact, we're going to start with something much more muted. So, we'll grab our white, we'll grab an equal mixture of our cerulean blue, we'll grab about a third of that Mars black, and we'll see where we end up. I think I want something a bit more blue, so we'll double up on our cerulean, just like that. Do a little test up here to see how I like it in relation to the sky, and I think this is actually a great pigment. So now that I know that I like the pigment, I'm going to double down, mix significantly more of it, just right beside the initial mixture. And now our pigments are getting diluted, but they're not diluted by a green, which is the important part. And you can see that I'm taking it slow, not going with too much of anything at one time, but building on what we had. We are very close. I think we just need a little bit of titanium white, and we'll be there. You can still see that first mixture to the left-hand side, and now we have that perfect mix. So, we make sure that we don't have areas that are a bit more blue, white, or black. We'll expand it so it's easier to grab. Switch over to our liner brush, make sure that it's nice and damp. Again, dipping it in clean water. And now, we're going to go in, and we're essentially just going to draw the top of the waterfall. And that means covering little portions of the sky, as well as the mossy rock. We're going to essentially move over almost the entirety of the top, but we're going to skip a couple little divots. Here, noticeably one. I'm continuously going back, grabbing more water, grabbing more paint. These are strokes you want to be nice and sharp, nice and finite. So we are really working to achieve that. And then I'm going to start working my way down. And I'm doing that, as you can see, with a tap and then a drag. A tap and a drag, a tap and a drag. I'm not going in with any grand abundance of paint here initially. And the application style is going to change dramatically depending upon the type of water and how it's falling. The type of water. Depending upon the way the water reacts to the land in which it is falling from and falling on and bouncing off of, the water is the same, but it's changing dramatically in form due to the area in which it interacts with, right? So here we have a lot of diagonal markings that are kind of a bit more of a misty falling effect, right? You can see as I expand, there are little openings. A lot of them have sharper bottoms, and then they move up into a V-like shape, but they connect to each other occasionally. So it doesn't look like this grand amalgamation of pattern which just very quickly becomes monotonous. It's kind of always evolving. And as we get towards the bottom, where at the top it's a bit more lean, we're going to get to something more thick, a little more prominent. And you can see that it all works in together. This isn't the only way we're going to paint water, and this isn't the only hue we're going to use, but it is a good start. I also don't want to go down too far. I'll do little amounts of it here and there, but I do want to change the pigment as I get closer to the bottom. So we apply that. Over here it's much more of a almost tap, it's less congested, it's less connected, it's a bit more thin, and then it works its way into the rest of this. See that? So unique. We'll go back, we'll grab more, we'll head over here, and this is going to be a lot like this, but it's going to be thicker. So here, you can see it's more of a line than what we have here. We have an abundance of water that's falling. It's heavy, it's uniform. We're occasionally going to take little breaks, little divots like that, and then we can resume. We'll allow it to get slightly more thin as you move towards the right-hand side of it, and we make it more thin by going from all of that very tight tap and dragging to a less tight tap and drag. Just let it dissipate fairly naturally. And then we have a little bit of a trickle down right beside it. As we continue moving towards the right-hand side, we skip an area. And then we have a bunch of lanes of water, essentially. You can see in the reference photo. And then they very quickly amalgamate into something right here, which is very full. So you can see I'm going in with a much larger, much more broad stroke as it unifies. And I'm even doing a bit of a blend. So it's not only going downwards at this point, it's coming together. Again, we're going across the majority of the top first. Here we have more of that stronger fall in pigment, which does end up expanding, much like that, and connecting into what we have here, which we can build out. Again, not going too far down with this pigment, but I will do a little bit of it in a way that I know that we're going to want to. And then the edge over here is also fairly definitive, but it's going to have a little bit more of that misty look. So I'm not going for as many hard, sharp strokes on the very edge, and I'm just letting it kind of move up in this almost check mark angular application, which is then softened. And I just soften it by moving my brush over the edges very lightly. You don't need to apply a massive amount of pressure, and when you do apply pressure, your brush and your bristles expand, which makes a larger marking. So when you want something nice and sharp, you go in with as little pressure as possible, and then you get a really nice line. But as you run out of paint, by continuing to make those applications, you can soften. So it's a technique that's just so versatile. There we go. We have this opening in the water right through the center here. So I'll just mark that, note it. And from there, we're going to augment our pigment, but also get you a little bit closer. Okay, so now, it's going to be a little bit tricky for me to show you the palette, just because we don't have a lot of space, but I'm grabbing an abundance of titanium white, and I do mean an abundance, and I'm making all of this brighter, substantially. You can see that it's getting closer to the lighter pigment that we had in the sky, and we can actually go with something even brighter than that. We're not going to yet, we're going to slowly build it up, but much like our last application, try to get something that's nice and consistent in both the value and the hue. Now, switching back to the liner, grabbing that pigment, we're going to head to the larger bodies that are falling, so the center areas of the larger pieces, and we're going to build that up a little bit. So we talked about having all of these little arrows essentially falling, all of these triangular pieces. We're essentially going for the bottom of those and then allowing it to dissipate as we work our way upwards. Here's a big example, okay? Sharp at the bottom, and then I'm softening predominantly on the inside, going up a little bit on the outside. And then I'm doing lots of little taps and drags to make it feel nice and cohesive. But this is essentially adding a lot of volume to our water, making it more three-dimensional. We have that light working off of it now. And we can even do it with the smaller portions, like through here. We can create new areas should we want to. And this isn't the brightest pigment that we're going to use, so we can do this without real hesitancy. But now, as I continue to move down, I'm going to essentially continue all of those applications that we were previously doing without that darker blue backing. And that's going to make these just a bit brighter, a bit more unique. That's something I really wanted to achieve. I wanted the hue to change as we move down, not just the value. And the way in which the water is progressing is also going to change a little bit. You can see that I'm making longer vertical strokes towards the bottom. And then we're essentially going to have a lot of splashing mist down here. Something we don't have to paint in just yet, and we actually don't want to. Also doing a little bit of finger painting. Never get too old for finger painting. There we are. Looks a little bit awkward, being that it's the only area that has it currently, but as we start to expand, and you'll see this soon, it'll feel a lot more connected, and it'll make the piece as a whole significantly better. So following the same application rules for each of these areas, this one, again, it's a bit of a heavier, more distinct fall. And because of that, our applications are quite connected. We're applying it predominantly to the left-hand side of this stream. And we're doing that because it progressively lessens towards the right-hand side. Something I realized I was doing over here was I was making these a lot more thin than I should have. I was getting a little hasty with my applications. Don't do that. We want it to become more full as we get towards the bottom, and that's not only through connection, but it's through application. So I'm trying to be mindful of that here now, especially as we get towards the bottom, which will be covered for the most part, but the more we finish it towards the bottom, the more opportunity and leniency we have in determining what areas we do cover up. We're not kind of locked into certain decisions. Heading over here. Again, not too many towards the top, but a little bit. And then it really starts to fill out towards the middle. And these actually connect to a much greater degree. But we're getting to the point where we're moving away from very distinct detail with the taps and the applications, and we need to start to look at it, again, a bit more holistically. We need to look at it as a singular cohesive unit. So what I'm going to do here is just finish up this area briefly, and then we're going to move the camera back, and I too am physically going to move farther away from the canvas so that I can paint with a greater visual perspective. and just ensure that it's progressing naturally as a whole. So here we are, a little bit farther back, and that looks messy, to be honest, which is okay. It's part of the painting process, and I wanted to point it out because often with acrylics, because of the way they're applied, because they are thin, very often the painting will go through these very awkward stages. And that's fine. That is no fault of yours. It doesn't mean that you're painting incorrectly or wrong, or that the painting is going to turn out poorly. What it means is you're painting with acrylics. And it's just part of the process. Have faith in yourself. Have faith in what we are going to accomplish here today. Don't let segments like this stop you from finishing the painting, because regardless of how much experience and how great you are at this, you are going to have parts of the painting that do look awkward, and it is not your fault. With that said, we're going to continue, but I'm switching to the filbert brush. I love this brush. I think that it's the perfect size for what we want to do here. It's very versatile. We have the rounded edges for softer blends. We have that sharper top for delivering more intentional strokes. And with that, we're going to work into a bit more of a larger body, which is why we want this. So we'll grab our pigment. I'll start over here on the left-hand side so I can define my edges essentially. And you can see just how easy that's all coming down. But then I'm going to use that sharper head of the brush to create some areas that are falling, right? You can see that little bit of water disconnected. We'll apply that on the other side as well. Just like that. Then we'll thicken the body here. We'll do a little tap. Ensure that these brush strokes, because they are a little bit different from our previous one, are integrated in the rest of the painting. That way they feel cohesive everywhere. So we'll just build some of these bodies. There we go. And then we'll head back through here and create larger applications. So I'm pressing harder with my brush again. I'm allowing that water to move upwards. We're occasionally leaving openings, as you can see. Creating some nice thick applications in the middle bodies. I'll very softly work over this because there will be not a lot of water, but a little bit, and you can see that minor amount of transparency. Now I want to connect this area with that area, so I'm just going to build this up. Similar applications, taking out some level of detail, very intentionally. We can always go back and add detail through additional highlight and tap. So it's nothing to worry about. And I think when a lot of people start painting, they're very hesitant to remove detail because we worked so hard to achieve it, right? But it's a really big part of the process and balancing paintings as a whole. Not every part has to be hyper detailed, and often getting that balance and that transition from hyper detail to less is going to do a lot more for your painting than having a hyper busy subject which looks unnatural because of it. That said, this brush is also great because it has a larger head and we can blend paint. So I'm going to make a brighter variant of that which we have. I'm going to start applying that to the bottom. Much like the last applications, we are putting it in the primary bodies of the falling water. Just like so. Have it dissipate as we move upwards. You can see that despite simplifying, we are able to re-interject extra depth, extra texture, all of that good stuff. Again, little taps, redefining sharp edges after all of those soft applications. We can also do this with the liner brush, but the intent here is just to normalize the stroke of the filbert within these pre-existing areas. Just kind of have it all acclimate together. We can do a little bit of that highlight towards just the very top, but then I do want it to get a bit more blue and then to become more white again. And it's not a pure white at all. It's very intentionally not. You don't want it to look blown out or overexposed, like a photo may. Let's grab even more titanium white. Continue to brighten. Very specifically dodging the areas that have green in them. And every time we do this, we will be building on that depth in the painting. Now, something we do want to avoid is having it look like ice. So I'm trying to not get too hard of an application through a lot of this, going for softer markings, going for semi-transparent edges. These are all ways of maintaining the water look. Would be fun to paint some icebergs though in the near future. Maybe as we get a little closer to winter, we could explore that together. There we go. Now, going to mix an even brighter highlight, just a little bit. Put that brush down, switch over to the liner, grab said pigment, re-interject it on the top, a little bit through the fall, and then re-establish that really nice detail that we initially had and had to forego slightly. And we're kind of just going back and forth until we find the perfect balance of soft and sharp. And you can see we're reintroducing that sharp down to the bottom to a point, and then I go more into a full brush stroke to simplify. It's not all of one or the other. It's about balance. And this is also helping us maintain that watery look over ice. That said, I'm going to need a greater highlight for a lot of the larger body down here, just because it is bright and blocky. But you can see just how much of a difference all of this tapping and texture makes. It's fairly subtle through here, but noticeable. I'm going to grab more titanium white, interject that into the mix. Have to be careful not to go with a pure titanium white. Softly blending some of it, allowing other portions to be much more harsh, distinct. Even building a little bit of texture here and there. I think we're really starting to get somewhere. But this is why we don't get discouraged when we go through the awkward phases, because stages like this are right around the corner. It's just a good lesson in life too, you know? Sometimes things look a little tricky. We're not sure how we're going to manage them. Things might even seem insurmountable. But if we keep at it, if we're diligent, if we are cognizant of that which we are doing, how we are approaching the situation, keep a level head and continue to act on our passion, we build something that we can really love. But it's only through that continued action that we get there. We can't let the fear of failure get to us. We can't internalize that. We need to continuously reaffirm to ourselves that we can do it, it'll be okay. Really like how this is turning out. Now for the next step, we are going to have a lot of fun building some depth and starting on our mist, which the waterfall is creating. So for that, we are going back to the larger flat-headed brush. We're grabbing a good amount of our titanium white, little bit, and I do mean a very little bit, of our cerulean blue, and the smallest amount of Mars black. We're taking the excess off to the point where you can't really even see it, but we essentially want a pigment in the very least as bright as what we have for our greatest highlight, and we can go a little bit brighter. Now I'm going to start by using the elongated edge and the corner to do a little bit of tapping here at the bottom, just to make sure that the pigment that I'm currently using is cohesive. Then I put the bottom of the brush in line with the bottom of the waterfall, and I work my way up. And I relieve pressure with each and every one of these strokes. And then I'm going to work it over here. And this time, I'm going to start moving up. Very wet brush, not a lot of pigment on it, it's mostly water. And I'm going to start building out my mist. We can build it up the waterfall, but I can tell that there's a larger amount right through here. I'm going to try to carry it through this way. Much like the water itself, I want the body of the mist to be a lot more thick, with the edges to be more soft. And you can see as I really start to run out of this pigment, we can get those nice transitions along all of the edging. Just like that. So despite the fact that we're using a brush with a sharper edge, we're able to achieve a very soft look. Again, going back to the finger painting, though if you do finger paint, as I have been, make sure that your hand is very clean. You don't want the oils from your hand accumulating on the canvas, especially to the point where it builds up and that area of the canvas no longer accepts water. So it's something to be careful with. Here I'm just grabbing some of the extra pigment that's a little bit higher on the bristles, applying that to the body of the mist, blending it out. Something I'm continuously going back and doing, but I'm also jumping around a lot to A, balance it, but B, give certain areas time to dry. That way I don't overload it with water. That said, I will grab a little bit more water, a little bit more pigment, a little bit more water, a little bit more pigment. Go back to the bottom of the waterfall, build that out to a greater degree. this edge over here is going to have quite a bit. You can see that we're losing the harsher contrast of the mossy background, which is why we could go in and give it such a higher contrast initially. Also, don't just add it to the left and right. Make sure that if it's on the left here, that it extends into the waterfall and into all of the openings in the water. Same goes for this side and the larger openings to the right. Yet again, we mix more pigment. Smallest amount of Mars black possible. Grand amount of titanium white. Making it quite wet, not to the point where it's a glaze, but almost. Starting in here, working our way out. I have a lot of pigment on my brush right now that I'm trying to be careful with. So I'm trying to use the majority of it in here. And then when I start to run out, I'll really get more playful. You can also take a little bit of it off on a towel or paper towel. There we go. Starting to look nice and unique. A bit playful in the motions. You can also go back to the filbert to get some softer applications if you want it to be extremely precise. I do not yet, right now. I might later, but right now I don't. So I'm not doing that, but it is an option. And I'm slowly just building up the brightness, the values. Really like the idea of this edge just being so much more bright to further highlight the eventual starker silhouette that'll come right there. And you can see it's just this very natural progression. We're not rushing anything. We're not hyperfixating on any one area or overworking it. We're working fairly loosely, freely, jumping around. Rendering something very natural. Again, same technique. Putting the brush on that bottom line, doing a little flick up, relieving pressure as we do. Now we can go back and touch up our waterfall a little bit later, but I want to see how the rest of the painting progresses before we do any of that. So we're going to move over to the foreground over here on the right hand side. We're going with the larger 1-inch flat. I've drawn it in fairly loosely with some Conte. And again, as per usual, if you want help with any of the drawing process, the line work, getting the scaling, sizing, all of that right, the traceable is up over on Patreon. So if you want to work with a mini projector or tracing paper or just with the gridded version to sketch it out, all of that is an option, and there's a link to that in the video description, where you can also get the ebooks, the reference photo, all of that good stuff, bonus lessons. But with that, we're going to jump into this. So I want a mid value, but we're closer than we were here. So we're going to have less of that atmospheric light diluting it. So we're going to have something a bit more saturated, a bit more of that innate, more vibrant green coloring. And we can also have something that's a little bit darker. That way we can build a contrast between the mid value, the dark, and then very specifically the lighter values. So here we have our initial mid value. We'll start with sap green. All of this is dry, so I don't have to worry about it. We're going to add in Mars black, titanium white, and the goal here is essentially to render something similar, but a little bit darker and a little bit more saturated. We don't want it to be a lot more saturated. We don't want it to be a lot darker. We just want it to be a natural progression. And I think I like what we have if it's just a little bit brighter like that. But now I want it in abundance. So we'll mix that up. And because we're working with the larger flat, we can very easily work around the rocks. That said, I have a grand abundance of pigment on my brush currently. And it's one of those things where it's making it to the point where it's difficult to apply sharp paint. So what I actually want to do is get the majority of this pigment off my brush. I could do that on a cloth, paper towel, but we do have a large area that needs pigment. So I'm actually just going to apply it here, and I'm avoiding the edges. So you can see that we're kind of working backwards through this application, just because we had so much paint on our brush. But once we have most of this off in a nice thick layer, which we do, I will make my brush damp. I will grab more of this, and then with significantly more control, I'll render the edging. You can see that I'm not only rotating the brush, but my arm fairly dramatically. All quite intentional. It looks a little bit darker on camera than it does in person just because of the lighting and the angle. But I want that to act as a reminder that the lighting that you have in your room will dramatically affect the painting. If you're painting in warm light, your painting will be warmer. If you're painting with a neutral light, it will look the way it should. So do consider the lights that you have in your room. If you're painting with a warmer overhead light, consider getting something external that you can move in to change that. That way, when you put your painting up and it's the middle of the day and you have that natural light on it, it looks the way you actually want it to. When I was in high school, sorry, I know you probably can't see that. When I was in high school, I stayed up one night, did an all-nighter, finished a painting for an assignment that I had, and I loved it. And when I went into school with the painting, when I took it outside, I realized it doesn't look the way I thought it did. It was a lot cooler of a painting. The blues weren't warmer blues. They were cooler blues. But I didn't recognize that at the time because I was painting it in a bit of a warmer setting with warmer light. And it was one of those things where you only have to do it once. You only have to learn once. But it's something that I feel like most of us do end up doing at least once. And it's just to be good to be cognizant of it, right? Because we don't always think about it. And sometimes our paintings just end up living in the space, and perhaps there isn't a lot of windows. but if you ever end up wanting to sell your paintings or give them to people, you probably want to take into consideration what it looks like under natural lighting. Just something to consider. That said, we need to let this dry fully, and then we can head in with some texture. Now we're going to head back to our damp, larger flat-headed brush, and you can see all of the darker hues that we have over here. We are going to make the darkest one yet. We're going to use an abundance of sap green and about 1/3 of that cerulean blue to our sap green. We still want it to fit within the larger atmosphere of the painting. So we want that cool pigment worked into it, but we don't want it worked in to an abundance where it pushes the subject backwards in the painting. And again, we're going for something darker, but we don't want it to be too dark. So I'm playing with all of this right next to our previously applied darker pigments, and we're going to aim for something that still can progress, but is without a doubt a standout pigment in relation to that which we've already applied. And I think we're just about there. I think that's really nice. So we'll flatten a lot of it, get the extra pigment off of our brush, and head back to our fan brush, which I did wash after using it and then let it fully dry. You do need to let it fully dry if you want the very sharp applications. If you want larger applications with it, like 4, 5, 6, then you do dampen it. But we do want a grand collection of them right now. So what I'm going to do with this is work similarly to what we did over here, in that I want to create the general movements of the rock, but I'm also going to incorporate a lot more randomization into these, and something I'm going to focus on is applying it to a much greater degree at the bottom, and then allowing it to dissipate as we move up. And we're doing this to the point where there really isn't going to be much of a visible pattern towards the bottom. We're still being mindful of the way in which we apply it, the directions, but it isn't going to be hyper noticeable. I'm also being very careful around these edges because we have all of these protruding bristles. It can be difficult to maneuver, and we don't want it kind of out into the actual water. So if you feel like you have a larger opening over here because you were just hesitant to apply there, it is okay. Just go back in with the liner brush. It's not going to look exactly the same because you are working with significantly more bristles put together, but this is a base layer. We are going to be layering on top of it, so it's okay if we're a little bit lenient in our application style. And again, as I move up here, I really don't want to use too much paint, letting it dissipate. I'm even softening these markings a little bit. That way it looks like it's getting maybe a little bit easier towards the top, and then it gets sharper towards the bottom, just like that. I know fairly may be a little bit difficult to see in the lighting, but the point is, it isn't a stark difference between the two, so it should be difficult to see, even in person. I can only really do so right now because it's wet and has a bit of extra reflection, where the backing doesn't, but it should look like that. That said, we do need to let that dry, and while we let that dry, we're going to switch back over to our 1-inch flat-headed brush, and I'm going to take some of this dark pigment that's already there. I'm going to create a little path up the side of this. Very simple. Gets lost quickly. But then I'm going to start applying it down here towards the bottom, creating all of these markings for distant rocks, which line the base. You want your brush to be nice and damp, Some of them will protrude to a greater degree. And then once we have that nice clean edge, we can start applying that paint towards the top of our markings and then drag down. And I want the majority of my strokes to be horizontal, but this is just a really safe way of starting that progression down here rather than working horizontally so close to the larger top and opening. And I'm already going to change this pigment quite a bit. So we have the Mars black, but I actually want more cerulean blue than I do green, and we want a little bit of titanium white. So we're just switching up the dominant color to the cerulean blue, and then we're working horizontally like that. As we continue to progress down, we'll need an abundance of paint, so I'll remix. Just like so. Make it a little bit brighter. Giving it a nice thick base. And as we get towards the bottom, I need to move the camera down. There we go. And we're going to go even darker. So I'm adding in extra Mars black. This is the darkest mix yet. And we're essentially going to have a gradient from the true foreground contrast to the foreground-ish. It's still the foreground. It's a little closer to the midground, but it's that progression, even though it's subtle, that will give us good depth long term. Then I'm just going to go through and soften all of this, though these are going to be an abundance of rocks, so having a little bit of texture, brushstroke in there really isn't the worst thing. That said, we were just doing this to use our time while that dries, so we should clean this brush a little bit because we will need it for blending, and then we'll head back up here for some highlights and details. Now that we've given this area a chance to dry, we are switching back to the 1-inch flat. We're going to grab some of our green, and you remember this pigment that we mixed way in the beginning? We're going to work towards that, but we're going to do so progressively. And our first pigment will be a little bit closer to that, and then we're going to transition through layering. But this can be slightly more saturated than what we have here. So we'll still darken it with a little bit of Mars black, and I don't have to worry about any diluting because all of this is essentially dry at this point. But I think that's a great first step. We'll switch over to our fan brush. It is dry, it is clean, and these markings are going to be quite intentional and specific. So I'm going to begin by creating them right up here, dodging this middle area, and then starting again on the other side. I want this to act as a little path to create the sense of adventure within the piece. Now we'll grab more pigment. This little area protrudes, so light will be able to come down, touch the top of it, and I want to accentuate that fact. Light will also be able to touch the top of this area of rock, so we accentuate that. You can see that there's a slow build. It's not dramatic. This pigment isn't wildly different from that which we've used previously. Now let's brighten it up just a little bit. We'll do this slowly. Titanium white, green, Mars black, green, Mars black. There's a hint of it on the side so that I know what I'm mixing to. But again, I am mixing slightly brighter and slightly more saturated. So I think we'll just add that extra bit of sap green. Grab that. Now I'm going to go over my previously applied areas, but not in abundance. We're just trying to naturally build on this. We want sharp applications. You can see that I'm rotating my brush so that I get slightly different markings each time. Doesn't have to be dramatically different. And a lot of these start out as horizontal or horizontal-ish, and then I very quickly move to this climbing mark making. See that? Really starts to build. There we go. We can add a little bit of it up here, but I don't want too much. So I'm going to do this area as I start to run out. And I'm going to accentuate some of the more vertical portions of the rock rather than making them all horizontal. So it's a bit different. There we go. Yet again, we are going to brighten. So added sap green, a little bit of added titanium white. Much brighter. We need to be careful with this, not to overdo it. I'm going to start at the bottom here. This is where we've been building from. Again, I'm not trying to cover up all of the previous markings, I'm just adding a little highlight to that which is already there. And there's another, essentially, piece of protruding rock here that sticks out. So we're just going to catch the side of that. Do a couple little taps back. Not overdoing anything, but you have this very natural progression. It's almost like you could climb it. Going to do slightly more up here, but not in an abundance. There we go. Might soften it with my finger. So it takes out a little bit of the sharpness. Makes it look higher up. Now, we're going to interject a very minimal amount of our cadmium yellow medium hue. This is the first time we've used this, and it's because, again, as we get closer to us, we get to see more of the innate coloring of these subjects. And again, very careful with it. We don't want much. But it can be a gorgeous addition. Words. There we go. Lovely. Going to have a couple little pieces kind of spawn out. A couple little randomized taps. Like that a lot. Like that a lot. So now we're going to move down in the painting. We are going to start by working with the larger flat-headed brush and making sure that it is nice and damp. It is, by the way, the next day, so everything on my palette is fully dry. And we're going to start on these rocks. So with these, I want to begin by working with a mid value. And this is going to be a combination of Mars Black. I think I'm going to mix it right here, actually. That way I can see it in contrast with some of the greens and the blues. And everything here is dry, so it's not a worry. We'll grab some titanium white, about an equal mixture. It'll render a darker gray because the Mars Black will just be a bit stronger than the titanium white. And we want to give it the atmosphere of the painting, right? So we're going to grab Cerulean blue, but an equal mixture here initially of what we used in the titanium white. And it would give us this really nice, cool gray, which I actually love. I don't think we need to continue editing or augmenting this at all. So we'll put that down. And I'm going to switch, for the first time, to our smaller flat-headed brush. This one's great because it has that nice sharp top, sharp corners. Excellent for smaller details, but can still pick up a good amount of paint. I'm making sure that it's nice and damp as we do. Grabbing that pigment. I'm going to take my pinky finger, ground it on part of the canvas or the easel to eliminate shake from my hand. And then I'm going to begin by working on these highlights to the larger rocks that we have. And you might wonder, where do the highlights go? Typically, it's on the top of the rock that's going to be receiving the most light, or the angle of the rock, the side of the rock that is facing the light. And if the light's coming down, it'll be on the top on this one. It'll work down the sides a little bit. You can see that I redrew in some of the rocks, and again, if you'd like help with the drawing process, the traceable is up over on Patreon, where you can also get the ebooks, exclusive access to our Facebook group where everybody shares the renditions of these pieces, bonus lessons, all of that good stuff. It's also just a great way to support the channel. But never any pressure at all. You don't need traceables, you don't need reference photos. They are just tools should you want them, you know? One of those things where we all create differently. Here you can see we're still just working in the tops. Now this is a rock as a whole that is just the top for the most part. And I know that this subject, in relation to our others, is very visually basic. That's okay. We're going to add in a lot of texture, a lot of detail, but we're just building the structure right now, essentially. Here, I'm doing some lines, not only horizontally, but downwards, to show how the rock has multiple levels and layers. It's something I avoided to a point in these ones because they were a bit farther away, and you're only going to see this level of detail with the closer ones. But when we are closer, we can execute on them like that. Also, I know you are quite far away. I just wanted to show you the larger perspective, and again, a lot of these strokes are quite large, so you should be able to see them fairly well. Leaving little openings in between a lot of it. And there we go. Don't be afraid to take out empty spaces and void detail, because we will be adding that in via texture. That said, those are the larger rocks. Let's get in closer for the smaller ones. So here we are, a little bit closer, grabbing more of that pigment with our wet brush. And I'm going to start working on some of the rocks below. And this is essentially going to be looking to create transitions from highlights. So we have a highlight on the top, and then it gets deeper into a shadow. Maybe we'll do a little line there to show that it's moving downwards. Then we have one for the top, and maybe this rock extends a little bit farther, right? Head back to our palette. We'll have some rocks along the side here, and because we have these highlighted rocks on the side, we don't have to paint a highlight on the side of this rock. We might do one just through here and here to show that it moves downwards, but we don't have to essentially draw an edge, something we want to avoid a lot in painting. In drawing, we get used to rendering our edges when we're not shading, but in so much of painting, it's actually about defining subjects in space without having edges highlighted. It's the contrast of values and colors that do it. You know? There we go. See, a lot of these rocks are smaller, they're connected, they're overlapping. We're just painting the top. Some of them extend downwards, some of them do not. A lot of it is visually ambiguous. You can also see a lot of the Conte showing through. That's okay. I very specifically used Conte here so that that could occur. And when it did, I could just take it off with a little bit of a wet brush or cloth. I just need to let the paint that we're currently applying dry fully before we do that. Also, as we get farther away, which we are starting to do, my strokes are going to become much more horizontal. Here we have a lot of dips and movements. We're going to move farther and farther away from that. So, you can see that I'm getting a little bit more loose with my stroke. I don't have to do that, but because it's so much horizontal stroke making, it's easy to fall into patterns and make it all look very samey, too similar to the point where it's unnatural. So I am very intentionally loosening up my stroke to void the chances of that happening. They're still going to happen to a degree. Here we're on the side, we can build actual rocks again that we can distinctly see. So that means more vertical mark making, more rounded edges, like that. Make a much bigger one here actually, that looks nice. Still trying to be somewhat loose. There we go. Put that brush down temporarily. Rebuild our pigment as I was starting to run out. I'll work it into the last one. It's nice and easy. We can make this a little bit brighter too, as a whole. There we are. And I'm going to splash this new pigment, because it's a little bit brighter, into our previous applications, especially the tops of the larger rocks, because they'll receive the most amount of light. They're protruding, they don't have shadows cast on them from other rocks that are sitting lower. And it's worth noting, every time we go and we apply a new layer, even if the pigment is the same or very similar, it's going to look quite a bit brighter because we are working on top of a blue-ish gray rather than on top of a black, and that in itself will make it brighter because acrylics are semi-transparent, so you always see the pigment underneath. Well, not always, most of the time. You can work with very thick pigment and no water, and you can achieve that. But you sacrifice some level of control in your stroke and your application. So I typically don't like to. But point being, often we do see the pigment underneath, and it makes it so that we're not actually painting with the pigment that we have on our palette. We're painting with an amalgamation of what we have on our palette and then what's pre-existing on the canvas. I know that this is starting to look very messy, That's okay. Like we talked about earlier, part of the process, just trust the process, trust yourself. We'll get it there. We just need it to go through this awkward stage so that we can build the real detail. That said, we are going to move into the back here. Lots of little taps. There are going to be some rocks that are stand out. I'll just paint those in. They're larger, but they are slim to none. And then again, lots of little taps. This time I'm just really using the corner of the brush. I'm not even using the whole head of it anymore, because that would be too big. And then down here, we'll go a little bit closer so I can go back to actual rocks, or strokes that look more like rocks rather, more elongated. As you get up here and you find it difficult to render really tiny markings, you can also switch to the liner brush. But if you feel comfortable with the corner of this brush, then you're fine. Making sure that we don't have any of that really dark silhouette directly against the water. And then I'll work it back down. Might flatten some of this as well. Yeah, that looks better. And then just taps in abundance. Also, just listening to myself talk, apologies if I have a morning voice. I essentially woke up, said to myself, I want to paint right now. I'm sure you've been there, but it was, I can have breakfast a little bit later. I can stretch and do all of those healthy things we should be doing a little bit later. And I'll just get right into the painting. Having it lead up this little path. Like that. It's a little exploratory. I think that's fun. Now, let's move the camera just a little bit. The next step is to create texture. We need to wait for this to dry for the most part, and I think we're just about there. It should be dry by the time we finish mixing our paint. I'm going to render a darker mix of what we currently have. So a lot of Mars Black, in addition to what we've been working with, making it in abundance. In abundance is apparently the term of the day. Actually, I always do a little keyword towards the end of these videos, and I don't know how close we are to the end of this one, but I like to give it to you so that you can use it in the comments, and it's just a little something you can include in your comment, or you can use it as a comment, but it's a little badge of honor essentially for those of you who make it towards the end of these videos. Just a subtle way of saying that, you know, you are one of the typically 13% who does make it to the very end. You can always see that in the analytics, but the term today will be in abundance because we are using it in abundance. You can work it into a sentence, or you can just type it. But with that, as you can see, we're going back to the fan brush, and we are tapping in texture to all of these rocks, creating all of the areas that have divots and holes and might be a little bit dirty. I'm rotating my brush for the application, but I'm always rotating it in the sky, in the air, in negative free space, because I don't want to do so on the actual canvas and start rendering strokes, because that's very easy to do. I'm a little more intentional in the foreground with how I'm placing my brush and the general angles in which I tap. However, as I move into the distance, it's much more of a loose process. But I think, as you can see, it's starting to make it look a bit more natural. It's still far from done, far from perfect, far from pretty. Might be getting a little pretty, but it's a good start. Grab some Mars Black, some Cerulean Blue, Titanium White. I just started to run out of paint, so we'll mix up a bit more. There we are. Like that. Get the majority of it off my brush. Back to the other brush for application. I love this fan brush. If you're new to the channel, this is actually a custom brush set which we just launched earlier this month, and all of the brushes are custom designed for these lessons. In the past, I used 2 fan brushes to make a lot of my paintings, one stiff, one soft, but we made this one very specifically to be both. So when it's dry, as it is now, we get all of these different little markings, and you can make them very prevalent or you can make them soft, depending upon your pressure and how much paint you're adding. But if you want a larger marking for something like foliage, then you just dampen it a little bit. It'll condense the bristles into 4 to, say, 8 clumps of bristles, and it makes that process really easy too. So it's just one of those things that is really, really happy we were able to accomplish here. And as we get into fall, and a lot of that fall foliage, it'll really come in handy for both texture but also delivering that foliage. And I very much look forward to sharing that with you. Definitely getting there. Looking far more natural. Love this. Looking for open areas that I may have missed, that are void of any real detail. Very good, very good. That said, yet again, not done. I do want to take off the contact, so I'm going to let this dry. It'll probably take about 5 minutes, and then upon its completion of drying, I'll just take a wet cloth, wipe it down, take off the contact, and then we'll continue the painting process together. So here we have it from a distance. It's looking good texture-wise. I like the progression. There's depth, but it's also fairly flat in terms of value, and we really need to build up the center area. We're going to have a lot of reflective light from the waterfall down into the wet rocks right here. So let's jump in there and start building it up. We're going to start by rendering a brighter variant of the blue that we essentially used for that. So we'll grab our cerulean, our titanium white. We'll mix that into the previous mixture, and we'll aim for something not hyper bright, because we want to be able to brighten it should we want to. We want that opportunity and that option. So you know what, we'll actually start with something darker, and then we'll just work it to be slightly lighter over time. I would have done this with the pre-existing mix, but because I had to wait for my canvas to dry, I ended up losing a lot of that pigment to dry time. You get a lot of questions also as to how do I keep my paint wet on the palette for long periods of time. I don't have a secret. I just add more paint when I'm switching batteries or things like that. That said, we're switching to the liner brush, grabbing some of that highlight, and now we can start reworking some of the structure back into this, because we definitely lost structure in the process of applying all of that texture. And here, as you can see, I'm redefining lots of the top, some of the edging. All of the areas that protrude. All of the ones that stick out to the point where they can catch light. Try and make a lot of these markings sharp, so my mix is quite watery. But you can see just how much this singular rock stands out in relation to everything else now. Let's make it cohesive. Let's make sure that it fits within the rest of the painting, that there is real visual context for it, and that it is not an anomaly. That said, there can and will be rocks that are anomalies, simply because there will be different kinds of rocks. Then they will have different hues, and they will reflect light differently. Textures will be different. We're going with very similar rocks in this painting, but it's important to remember that not all rocks are the same. Not all types of rocks are the same. I think when a lot of people start painting, they say, how do I paint clouds? How do I paint rocks? How do I paint trees? And the answer is 100 different ways, because there are different types of clouds, rocks, and trees. And they're all going to change dramatically depending upon the perspective, the lighting, that which is around it and reflecting light. There are so many little elements that have that impact. There we go. Now, something I do want to be mindful of is that we're applying these highlights to a lot of the rocks in the foreground right now, but I don't want too much along the edges. And where I really want this to build up is up through here. So I'm actually going to start doing it more up here, and then I'll find my way back down. And I'm working predominantly where we have the waterfall itself. A lot of these initial markings were done with that flat-headed brush. Now we're moving a different brush in. So we're going to try to match a lot of the mark making that we previously instilled. Remember that the rocks will get larger as we get closer to us, which means our strokes will get longer. We'll probably apply a little bit more pressure in the stroke as well. I'm going to go over a couple of these areas at the top numerous times because I am working with a decent amount of water. And I do want to ensure that I get some thick applications. I'm also taking a little bit of the contrast up here. So I'm filling in negative space. Just because we won't see that much detail that far away, it'll start to become a little bit ambiguous, and it's one of those things where, again, we sacrifice detail for the larger picture. Now we can start to see it coming together a little bit. Definitely need to widen things, especially through here. There we go. Like that. You can see how there is a light in the center and then it dissipates as you move out this way. Here especially because we have this blocking as a shadow, so it can extend to a greater degree to the left than it can the right. I'm actually going to, right now, make an example of that. Also, worth noting, this isn't our final layer. We are going to continue building. And it's one of those things where it'll just slowly continue to get better and better until you really like it. But, yet again, have faith in yourself, have faith in the process. Try different things. We have a lot of rock here that we can play with. There we go. Good. Let's take a quick look at it from an afar and then we'll jump back in. So, it's not quite there yet, but it's definitely better than where it was. We'll do another pass with a brighter pigment and then we'll reassess. I'm also thinking about adding in some moss, maybe a couple of flowers. Let's see what happens. So yet again, nice and close to the canvas. We're just going to grab some additional titanium white, work that into our current mix, and you know what? We always go for this very even mix. I'm not going to do that this time. I want it to be a bit more sporadic. I want to grab slightly different values and hues. So we're not doing a very clean mix for the first time in this process. Switching back to the liner brush after making sure that it's nice and damp. I'm going to start this time right up here. Again, I'm trying to flatten this a little bit. And then we'll progressively just work our way towards the foreground. Because we are working with a lot of water, while this might seem very bright right now, it will calm down a little bit as it dries. Acrylics do tend to darken a little bit as they dry, just naturally. Here I grabbed significantly more paint, but you can see that it's also just a brighter part of that mixture. It's really nice and sharp right now, which I love. Again, trying to avoid a lot of this space. We can do a little bit more, but I do want to be careful. And again, taking out some of that negative space by condensing areas, covering up openings to a point. Lots of the smallest low pressure taps I've ever done. I want these markings to be as tiny as they can be. And this liner brush is pretty great for it because we extended the bristles. It could pick up more water, and because of that I can kind of just continuously do this and not lose that little bit of like a flow state that we get into. But you can see just how tiny these markings are. And that's very much the goal through this process. Continuously going back, grabbing more water, grabbing more highlighted pigment. And by having these occasional, sharper bursts of light kind of shining on the rocks speaks to the fact that they're wet, damp. The mist from the waterfall will certainly do that. I was just at Niagara Falls in Ontario, Canada, where there is this giant waterfall, and it was at night. We were seeing friends, taking pictures, really enjoying that. but we were really close to the waterfall, and it creates this mist, and it almost feels like rain, and we're getting wet. And it's that question, all of a sudden, of before we were here it wasn't raining, but we're getting really wet. Is it the waterfall? And after staying there for about 45 minutes, again, just taking it all in, the experience, very much enjoying that, started to leave, get farther and farther away, and it's not stopping. It's still very wet. It's still seemingly raining. And then we realized it did start raining at some point, but we couldn't differentiate when it started raining and when it was just we were wet from the falls. So it was a fun experience. Point being, these rocks will certainly get wet. And this technique, these highlights, articulate that. There we go. I think it's looking a little too systematic though. You know? I think we just need to do a couple little splashes of highlight slightly more towards the left-hand side and do so sporadically. Just because it feels like there's too much structure. There we go. I think that's a lot better. Again, I want to build a little bit more. Very intentionally taking the brighter portions of our irregular mix for a couple of these and very select spots. Essentially using the waterfall as a light source because you have a very muted day. And it's the reflection from the water that's falling that's really going to determine a lot of this for us. So here yet again we have another slightly distant check. I like it, but I do still feel like we need to continue to add highlight here specifically. So we'll grab some cerulean blue, titanium white, Mars black, and I am mixing right now with the liner brush, something I don't typically do, but we don't really need a lot of paint, and because of the extended bristles, this is actually fairly decent at blending in relation to a lot of other liner brushes. So I'm just going to take the excess paint off so that I can get a very sharp marking, make sure that it's nice and damp. Grab that, head up to the top here, and we'll just tap on some of that great bluish highlight. Still adding in extra little taps for texture, defining new rocks, solidifying old rocks, connecting some. And I don't want to go too close to the foreground here. This is really just to accentuate the background, but we need to do hints just so that it feels cohesive, right? So not much, but enough to bring it together. Yet again, let's brighten. More titanium white. That is definitely the brightest mixture we've had thus far for rocks. Now when I apply this over previously applied highlight that we just did, it is going to get diluted to a point, so it isn't going to be as bright as it was on the palette or on the brush. I'm okay with that. Making sure that this top area is the brightest because it will have the most reflected light. Have it dissipate as we move towards the left there. You can see this really stands out beautifully. Which is why we have to be extra careful with it. Not do too much. But still enough that it makes sense in the context of the piece, right? There we go. I think we'll also add a little bit of extra moss to some of these rocks and just make there a connective area between those two. It's not hyper prevalent in the reference photo, but I think it could aid the piece. Taking those artistic liberties can be quite beneficial. So, next what I want to do is take some of our sap green, titanium white, Mars black, and render a green that's actually more similar to this than that. So we'll need it to be a bit more desaturated, which means more Mars black and titanium white. And we'll just go back and forth between these three pigments. Then interject a small bit of our blue, because we are slightly more in the distance. This is just a great little reminder that we don't go with the first pigment we mix. We do continue until we get what we actually want. And sometimes that means really jumping around, and that's okay. There we go. Paid off. So, going to clean my brush well. A lot of these applications were done through the fan brush. However, I think we have enough practice with this right now to get those really sharp markings without it. So I'm just going to bring some of this green, this muted green down, have it wrap around a couple of these rocks, not all of them, because we do want it to be a transition from the green to the rock. Now, we'll grab a little bit of our cadmium yellow medium hue and titanium white. See, it's closer to that. Continue. There's taps and applications. Following the preset areas, and then also interjecting little extra pieces as we do. Similar to when we were building the highlights on the rocks, we have a template essentially laid out for us, but we can definitely build and add to it. There we go. So far, very subtle. I like that. We have some brighter yellows, which I like. We'll tap those into here. Little flowers in the distance. Just towards the bottom. We can also incorporate them in here. Slight splash of color. Painting doesn't have a lot of that. Let's get closer again. So you can see that that transition is starting to happen, but we're not quite there yet. Making a little bit more of a green. Building this out, and then up into here. That way we ensure that our greens are cohesive. You can see that these marks are slightly larger than that of the fan brush. And you can switch to your fan brush if you want, but I just want slightly more control than that will offer. So I'm opting for larger markings over less control. Just defining lots of little rocks in here. Let's do just a little splash of this over here. Maybe over here too. Okay, now we'll just expand a little bit into the other side, and you don't have to do this. You can watch me do it first and then decide if you want to. But I kind of want to balance both sides of the painting a little bit. And I think by adding this little bit of green, we'll expand in a really interesting way. Again, not in the reference photo. Taking a chance here. If I don't like it, I can take it out. But you can see how subtle it is. Or maybe you can't see. That speaks to how subtle it really is. It's quite dark. Small details. But now we have these greens in both halves, tying the sides together. There we go. And we can do a little bit more in the foreground, just like that. To be honest, I'm looking in the viewfinder and I don't know how much of this you can see, just because it is so subtle. But you know me, I do like to go in with that less is more approach with a lot of these applications, and then I just very slowly build until I get what I want. I think it's working really well though. In person. Just a little bit of color goes a long way. Now, for the next step, I really actually liked the idea of the flowers. So, take some titanium white, we'll take a little bit of our yellow, about a third that of our green to our yellow. Want to desaturate it, a bit more white. And we'll paint in some actual little flowers. And by flowers, I mean little taps. Not actually delivering any detail this far away. I think if we did, it would look overdone. But a couple little clusters, I think, are a really nice addition. We can also use this as a slight highlight for some of the rock in the foreground. Not too much, but a little bit. All of the little things that add up, right? I'm just slowly expanding them to make them larger until they're the size that I want. Started with something small, then we build. There we go. I like that. It's unique. We're gonna add a couple over here. Like that. Just add a bit more highlight to this rock. It's kind of a centerpiece. There we go. Okay, now we're going to clean our water, clean our brushes, and get really close to this. Now we're going to switch back to and grab our filbert brush. Again, great round edges for blending, which is about what we're going to do. So I'm going to grab some titanium white. I have new titanium white on my palette, that way I don't accidentally grab diluted titanium white. We'll mix it over here close to the bluish white that we had, because we are looking to remix a pigment very similar to what we had in the waterfall. It means a little bit of Mars black, but it is predominantly a titanium white based mix. Do a little test in here. Just make sure that it's nice and cohesive. Maybe fill in areas of the waterfall that we really want to. And then once we know that we have the right pigment, we need to ensure that this is all fully dry. Mine is. And I think I need to go a little bit brighter. And now I'm going to add a little bit of this mist coming out in the distance over top these rocks to a point. You can use your hand to do a little blend. You can have it get lost right through here. That can be a nice look. Having the brush damp definitely helps. And then it just subtly works its way forward. And from there, with that established, we can go back to perfecting little details. And something I know I want to do post that is mix up a fairly light gray, similar to that of what we used for the top of the rocks. I still have that right here. And just redefine a little bit of edging in here. We have some great highlights with the greens and all of that, and I just want to make sure that they're present and prevalent with the highlighted rocks as well. But I think that really does bring together the painting. And as per usual, I'd like to say a big thank you to you for being here, for being a part of the community, for making lessons and time here possible. I love the community that we built. I think it's wonderful how many people end up making things with these tutorials, adding their own spins and just learning as we go, as I do through a lot of these. You know, I go in with a plan, but we definitely take detours and find new things out, and it's always a great experience. I feel like we're always progressing. Adding a couple little highlights up through here that I neglected to do earlier, but think it can really help. We can splash them throughout openings in the greenery as well. But again, big thank you to you for just being here, being a part of the community, being part of that likely 13% who makes it to the end. And again, you can use the keyword in the comment section. Also, the new brush set that we've been using through the entirety of this lesson is live. It is linked in the video description if you'd like to pick it up and use exactly what I'm using. Also, again, if you're new to the channel, up over on Patreon, we have the traceable, the reference photo, bonus lessons. There's also all of my ebooks, including Acrylics for Beginners, which is essentially the essentials. Everything you need to know about acrylic painting before you jump into your first acrylic painting. There are ebooks with just traceables. There's a private Facebook group you can get access to where everybody shares their renditions of these lessons. You can ask for assistance. There's a lot of really knowledgeable, incredibly helpful, warm people up there. And I talk about community a lot, but I love the community that we've been able to foster there. Always really fun to see the different renditions of these. I feel like it inspires me, it gives me ideas, and it's just a really great positive place. So again, you can get access to that through Patreon, and it's also just a great way to support the channel if you can, but if you can't, also no worries. There are a lot of really wonderful people who do take care of all of this and make sure it happens, and I never want it to feel like a burden in any way. But again, regardless of if you're up there or not, big thank you for being here. Big thank you to everybody who is. And as per usual, as always, stay creative.